So, welcome everybody today to our history of Christian missions. Some will be joining us, I'm sure, as we continue. But today we're going to look at Augustine, who was the first Archbishop of Canterbury. So really what we're going to look at is we're going to be looking at the Roman Catholic expression of missions. Last week, you'll recall that we looked at the life of St. Patrick. Amazing story, the apostle to Ireland. And the beliefs and practices that he followed became known and is still known as Celtic Christianity. But today we're going to look at Augustine. He's considered the apostle to the English, and he's viewed by many as the founder of the English Church. And his importance lies partly in the fact that it would be from Britain in the 19th century that a significant Protestant missionary movement would emerge. And the 19th century is regarded today as the great century in world missions. And if you're still with us next year, we'll arrive there sometime and meet some of the well-known and life-changing individuals. Firstly, though, there's two important things that we need to bear in mind about Augustine. Firstly, don't confuse this Augustine, who lived in the 6th century and became the first Archbishop of Canterbury, with Augustine of Hippo. He was an early church father who lived some 200 plus years earlier and was born and ministered in modern-day Algeria. The other thing to remember, and we have to remember this all the time, is that the church was overwhelmingly Roman Catholic until the Reformation, which happened in the 1500s. The exception, as I've said before, were the Celtic Christians, like Patrick, who eventually became mainly present in the borders or the extremities of what is today Britain. Of course, the Roman Catholic Church hadn't, at this stage that we're looking at the moment, already formulated all the doctrines we associate with it today, but it was already moving in that direction. And from the very beginning, Roman Catholic missions were closely tied to the Roman political and military exploits, which expanded the kingdom, and with their mass baptisms, which were a major factor in its growth. So its doctrines were evolving. Some would argue they are still evolving, and it expanded geographically, both through the Roman conquests and, I have to say, some pretty intrepid Catholic explorers, until it became, at that time, the most widespread expression of Christianity. But please understand, Augustine was not the first missionary sent to Britain. When he arrived, there were already Christians in Britain. So how did they get there? Well, they got there because Rome originally invaded Britain as early as 43 AD. Now that's only what, 10 years or so after Jesus had ascended back into heaven. Julius Caesar, the Roman emperor, wanted to get his hands on some of the natural resources. Apparently, in a letter he wrote, he'd heard there were a lot of cattle and sheep in the country. And so in 43 AD, the Romans arrived, and they stayed there for almost 400 years before leaving in 410 AD, by which time Britannia had become Christian, or the Roman Catholic version of it. And it would be 200 years later before Augustine would come from Rome. Now, in those 200 years between the Romans leaving and the Romans returning, pagan tribes had slowly begun to take hold, especially in the south of England. And Christianity had shrunk, really, and withdrew to the west, existing somewhat on the margins. So why did Augustine come to Britain, and who sent him? Well, to answer that question, we need to first meet Augustine's boss, since he was the one who originally sent him from Rome to be a missionary to Britain. So I'm going to give you a bit of historical background, more than I normally would. I hope your eyes don't glaze over when you hear this, but it just helps us understand a bit more of the history. The one who sent Augustine was Pope Gregory the Great. Now, Pope Gregory the Great is considered one of the most influential bishops of Rome. Perhaps unusually, as a monk, he developed a passion about taking the Christian message to the pagan groups who lived beyond the immediate borders of the empire. And so he kept on pushing for mission effort. What he wanted to do was to establish the church on the ruins by what was now the vanishing Roman Empire. But it was only once he became the Bishop of Rome, eventually, of course, they were called the popes, that he was finally able to transform his concern into action. So why was he considered great? Well, for a number of reasons. Firstly, he was admired pretty much universally because he gave up considerable wealth. He came from a very privileged background, but he willingly took a vow of poverty as a monk, so he gave everything away. He was also physically frail, probably not helped a lot by his rigorous commitment to fasting and his tendency to also experience severe bouts of malaria. Secondly, he was considered great because he had a great gift of administration, something that would be desperately needed as the Roman Empire came crashing down around him. Rome was in terminal decline. Rome had not only been successfully attacked by barbarian tribes, but it had suffered a devastating plague. Not only that, it had experienced 1 year a great famine and a drought, which was then followed by storms and floods of unusual severity. So the river Tiber, that's the river that flows through Rome, slowly crept up the city walls, finally broke over them and crashed into the low-lying areas, causing people to run screaming and claiming it was the judgment of God. Thirdly, he had the ability to speak to the needs of the people's hearts, something that's always the mark of a true great leader. And it was at such a time as this that Gregory was called by the then Pope, so we're going one step further back, Pelagius II, to be his assistant. However, within a very short time, Pope Pelagius, died from the very plague that I've been talking about, at which point it became clear that Gregory was to be his successor. So somewhat reluctantly, at the advanced age of 50, in 590 AD, he was consecrated Bishop of Rome. Now, Gregory felt no joy in his new appointment. In fact, the reverse, he was filled with foreboding, and he wrote this: "I fear greatly for those who have been committed to me." Well, of course he did. Rome, the once proud capital city of the world, lay around him crumbling and shabby. Plagues had killed 1/3 of the population of the entire Roman Empire, and the people were dejected and were numb through these devastating catastrophes. One writer wrote this: "From the city walls, one could see their fellow citizens chained together by the neck, being led off for sale as slaves. Starving and mutilated refugees, some with their hands chopped off, crept up to the gates." Well, Gregory tried to ransom as many prisoners as possible, even authorizing the bishops to sell some of the sacred vessels in the monasteries and the churches. And unusually, for that time, one of the first things Gregory did was to meet with the leader of the Lombards. Now, the Lombards were one of the tribes who had wreaked havoc in the city. His approach to the enemies was unprecedented, but it resulted in a peace treaty being drawn up and signed. How did he achieve that? Well, he was helped, no doubt, by the fact that he was willing to pay the leader of the Lombards an undisclosed sum of money for peace. And so the tribe then withdrew. Well, the emperor of Rome, Maurice, his name was furious that a treaty with this renegade group had been drawn up. He regarded them as no more than a collection of thugs and thieves. And in despair, he said to Gregory, so now it's the Lombards, is it, who are really in charge? And he even warned Gregory that he would face the judgment of God because of his deeds. In fact, 14 years later, Gregory would be forced to sign another treaty with the leader of the Lombards. Gregory was described, his character was decisive, determined, and dedicated. One example of this, which demonstrates his compassion, was that after his father died, and remember he came from a wealthy background, he immediately sold the whole family estate and gave the proceeds to the relief of the poor and also to 7 of the Benedictine monasteries. He disliked the emperor and became convinced that there was only one man who lived in that city who could possibly save the city of Rome. What he didn't realize was that he would become that man. So you can probably sense there was a tension between the emperor and the bishop, the one who would become the pope. Who was in control? Actually, there was no clear agreement as to who really ran the church. And in actual fact, the authority of the emperor would always have the final word, even over the church. This struggle would continue for a long time, and it would affect the history of Christianity and its relationship between the Christian religion and also the authority of the empire. Well, one of Gregory's lasting influences on the world was his impressive contribution to sacred music. Have you ever heard of Gregorian chants? That's a particular style of music that is sung today more or less in monasteries and also in some churches. A Gregorian chant. Here you are, I'll just play you a little extract. Here's a Gregorian chant. We owe this to Gregory. So there we are. Just a little bit of the music that comes from the time of Gregory.
Didn't hear anything.
Okay, apparently you didn't hear anything, never mind. You can find it on YouTube. So he had a big influence and he did good things, but also he advocated the beating and the torture of heretics. He was a prolific writer, and some of his 800 letters still survive. Anyway, what was this Pope's thinking about mission? Well, he wanted to resurrect a unified church from the decaying foundations of the Roman Empire. In fact, he wanted to extend the church beyond its Roman borders into the pagan areas. And there's one incident which may be apocryphal, that helped to energize and motivate him. One day in Rome, he saw some blonde, young British boys for sale in the slave market. They reminded him of angels. He's said to have declared in Latin, Angli sunt angeli fiant. Let me just explain this to you. Here we are. So this is what he said. You see, England was the land of the Angles. In fact, we still have that word. On the east side of England, we have an area still called East Anglia. So he said, if I translate it, you can see at the bottom, he saw these blonde boys for sale, British boys. He said, they're angels, let them become, sorry, they're angles, I'm reading it backwards here, let them become angels. Of course, angle and angel, one is the anagram of the other. But that had a profound impact on him. He thought, well, they need to hear something of the gospel because they've come from pagan Britain. And so that partly motivated him to reach out, because at this time, Britain was inhabited by all sorts of different tribes. The Angles were, interestingly enough, of German origin. You know, the blonde hair that Adolf Hitler wanted to be seen throughout Germany in his view of the Aryan people. Well, whatever the truth, whether he really did say this, we don't know, but it made Gregory put missions as a top priority. So in charge of this new Roman invasion was Augustine. He was a prior of St. Andrew's Monastery in Rome. And Gregory said to him, I want you to lead a company of monks all across Europe, and I want you to cross to Britain. Now, the journey across Europe with a company of monks would have a distance of probably 1,000 miles. I mean, today you fly from Rome to London. I mean, how many flights a day are there usually? And it takes about 2 hours. But then to march all these men through hostile lands was no small thing. Pope Gregory wanted to bring the light of God to the heathen English. In fact, this was almost the first example since the days of the Apostle Paul of a carefully planned and executed missionary journey. So here's the date, 596. Augustine's first task was to set himself to the conversion of the kings and the rulers. But it was not without its problems. I think in some ways, Augustine was probably not the best candidate for such a leadership role. And while they were making their journey through Gaul, through Germany and France, he and his friends lost heart. In fact, they turned back and asked to be relieved of their task. In a letter they wrote, they said, we shouldn't be compelled to undertake so dangerous, toilsome and uncertain a journey through such a barbarous, fierce and unbelieving nation. Gregory insisted they continue, and he wrote back, let not the toil of the journey nor the tongues of the men predicting evil deter you, but with all earnestness and zeal finish what by God's direction you have begun, knowing that a great labor is followed by a greater glory of eternal reward. Actually, Augustine's fears proved to be unfounded. England was divided up into a number of kingdoms, constantly at war with each other. As I said, the church had already been in existence since the 3rd century. So what happened? Well, early summer 597 AD, a large merchant vessel sailed along the huge chalk cliffs of Dover in southeast England and entered via Sandwich Bay along the mile-wide mouth of a river. Let me show you on a map that I've got here. Actually, it's the same map that I used last time. So can you see down here? There's France. Notice how close France is to the border of England. That distance there between two places called Dover and Calais in France is only about 23 miles, 30 kilometers. So it's not that long a voyage. But can you see next here on my map to Dover, we have Canterbury. I don't know how clear that is. That was where they entered what is now the United Kingdom. And I have to say, they entered in a place that isn't very far from where I'm right now talking to you all. So along comes this ship. In the bow, the front, there's a tall cleric, and behind him a group of more than 30 similarly dressed monks. The sailors eased the ship alongside a rough mooring. The Romans had returned after almost 2 centuries, but this time they were destined to have a much greater impact than the Roman legions who'd come ashore so many years earlier. Augustine landed in what is now the county of Kent. Again, I'm here in the county of Kent. It was then known as the Kingdom of Kent, because it was a lot of kingdoms, each with their own king. And Kent was a clever choice, because the King of Kent was King Ethelbert. What's important is that Ethelbert was married to a Christian princess called Bertha. So Augustine and the monks hoped this might ensure their safety and grant them favour. Now, I imagine Ethelbert was unaware that he was the target of a Christian mission. But why was he chosen? Well, as I've said, having a Christian wife maybe would make him more sympathetic to the gospel. She, by the way, came from Gaul, from the European mainland. And of course, there's always the hope that the king's subjects will always follow their leader. And maybe, I might be wrong, but maybe at the back of their mind was a political motivation to bring back this region of England under some sort of Roman control. Oh, by the way, how do we know all this? Because this is a long time ago. One man, a gifted writer and historian called the Venerable Bede, he wrote an ecclesiastical history of the English people. And he says that after arriving, Augustine and his party were asked to wait while the king considered what to do. Well, they didn't have to wait long. After a few days, Ethelbert and his court arrived, and the monks were summoned to an audience with the king. It took place in the open because of Ethelbert's superstitious reluctance to meet the Romans indoors. He said, if they had any witchcraft, they might, on entering the room, get the better of me. Bede tells us that the monks came into the clearing behind a tall cross and bearing a painting of Christ. They sang, "We beseech thee, Lord, in all thy mercy, that thy fury and anger may be taken from this city and from thy holy house, because we have sinned. Hallelujah." Amazing. Augustine then was invited to sit and speak to Ethelbert of the purpose of his mission. Ethelbert's response to this was careful. According to Bede, the writer, the king told Augustine, "Your words and promises are plausible, but since they're new and doubtful, I cannot at once agree to them and leave the customs which I've long observed with the whole English race." In other words, he said, Okay, I'll think about it. But he welcomed the Romans to his capital at Canterbury and allowed them to begin their missionary work. Well, their preaching and their virtuous life eventually caused the king to be converted. And by the end of the year, Augustine was able to baptize 10,000 of the king's subjects during the mission's first Christmas in England. For Augustine, this was important, as Ethelbert was the ruler of a large area of southeast and central England, extending from the Channel coast hundreds of miles up to the north of the country. The support of this powerful chief would allow Augustine to quickly establish churches in Canterbury and in the old Roman town of Durobrivis. Today that's called Rochester, and that's where I spent the first 4 years of my life, just 25 miles northwest of Canterbury, and then establish a church in London. In 601, a second party of monks arrived from Rome to reinforce Augustine's mission, which was busy building a monastery at Canterbury. But maybe you're thinking, what about the Celtic Britons? Well, they presented Augustine with a problem. Of course, many were already Christian. And the Celtic Church had survived a century and a half with hardly any contact with Rome. But it was clear from Gregory's instructions to Augustine that he had authority over all the bishops of Britain. So clearly he was aware of the existence of Celtic bishops. Now, the Celtic Church government, it didn't have any sort of central organisation. And Bede informs us that Augustine, using the help of King Ethelbert, summoned the bishops to a conference. Now, the first meeting was cordial, but it's not difficult, is it, to imagine the misgivings of the Celtic Church leaders. As one historian says, Rome was very distant from them. And I would imagine they felt they deserved a certain amount of respect because, after all, they kept Christianity alive in Britain in the face of invasion and slaughter. Indeed, the 6th century had produced a number of very holy Celtic fathers who'd done much to strengthen the church. Among them, for example, was the saintly Dewi or David, who became later the patron saint of Wales. Well, by the time of a second meeting with Augustine, Bede says the Celtic bishops had taken the advice of a wise hermit. They'd asked him, can you give us some wisdom? How should we respond to this emissary from Rome? The hermit said this: if Augustine is meek and lowly of heart, and the monks are also like that, then they ought to listen. If, however, Augustine is not meek but proud, it's clear that he's not from God and you shouldn't give any attention to what he says. And then the hermit suggested a very simple test to see if Augustine was really humble. He said, now, if Augustine stands up to greet you, Celtic Christians, then you must listen to him. But if he remains seated, then, quote, let him be scorned by you. Now, Augustine knew nothing of this. At the second conference, he remains seated. And then when the Celtic Christians found he didn't do as they had requested him, Augustine was very unhappy with them and started to threaten them. He warned them that if they would not accept peace with their brethren, in other words, with the Roman church people, they would get war from their enemies and would in revenge find death at their hands. What a sad, tragic, missed opportunity that was. One person who wrote about it, surprisingly, was Winston Churchill. So Winston Churchill, who was the great leader of the Allies throughout the Second World War, wrote a history of the English-speaking peoples. And in it, he speaks about this very incident. He said of this that an opportunity had been lost for a general and lasting peace for both races, reconciled in the name of Christ. And Churchill identifies two reasons for this failure. He says, first of all, there was the sullen and jealous attitude of the British bishops, and secondly, the tactless arrogance of Augustine. This sad failure to make any inroads with the Celtic British Christians effectively marked the limit of Augustine's mission. Sure, he strengthened the foothold he'd made in Kent, but in reality, he was unable to spread the gospel much further than Ethelbert's sphere of influence. Augustine died, as you'll see from your dates, in Canterbury in 604 and was later buried in the monastery church of St. Peter and St. Paul. The Roman mission continued, but it remained dependent upon royal support. And it developed into a very much of a stop and go affair of conversion and then relapses and then more attempts at conversions. One last issue that Augustine and his monks faced was problems relating to pagan traditions. Can pagan ceremonies coexist with Christianity? For instance, what should you do about pagan temples? I mean, this is very much a relevant issue today for those who are working amongst people from a pagan and an animist background. How do you respond to the ancient habits and customs of the people? Do you accommodate them? Do you compromise with them? Or do you destroy them? Well, Gregory's response, that's recorded by the Bede, goes along these lines. And in this, he's setting forth and establishing important Roman Catholic missionary standards for centuries to follow. This is what he said. The heathen temples of these people need not be destroyed, only the idols which are to be found in them. If the temples are well built, it's a good idea to detach them from the service of the devil and to adapt them for the worship of the true God. And since the people are accustomed, when they assemble for sacrifice, to kill many oxen in sacrifice to the devils, it seems reasonable to appoint a festival for the people by way of exchange. The people must learn to slay their cattle, not in honor of the devil, but in honor of God and for their own food. If we allow them these outward joys, they're more likely to find their way to the true inner joy. It is doubtless impossible to cut off all abuses at once from rough hearts, just as a man who sets out to climb a high mountain does not advance by leaps and bounds, but goes upward step by step and pace by pace. Much more could be said about Augustine. But he and his monks were largely responsible for planting the Roman Catholic Church in England. The efforts of Augustine to bring the leaders of the Celtic Church into the Roman communion which he represented completely failed, for they clung passionately to their independence. Ever since the arrival of Patrick in Ireland in 432, the gospel had flourished in that land. And there's no evidence whatsoever that Patrick recognized in the monks the authority of the worldwide Catholic Church. So, Augustine served but his service was restricted because he refused to accommodate himself and the Roman Catholic Church to the Celtic missionaries who'd arrived first. And today, the use of pagan places for Christian worship is an issue. But there is a belief and a practice that you can redeem a pagan place. You can even redeem pagan worship for the kingdom of God. And there are places in parts of the world that, yes, were previously pagan temples, but through prayer, through careful teaching, through repentance, that place can be redeemed and used for the worship of God. And when it's the only large place there that people are used to going to, provided it's explained clearly the change that's taken place, then usually it's possible to use the very same venue for the worship of God. The same is true of music. Pagan music, the lyrics can be taken away and replaced with Christian music. After all, that's something that Wesley did a lot. He would take hymns that were sung in pubs and bars, songs that were sung in pubs and bars, using that music and putting Christian truths to the very same musical notes. So there we are. Next week, I hope you'll come back, because we're going to meet the biggest external challenge the church has ever faced and continues to face even today. And I'm speaking of the challenge of Islam. Malu, could you unmute us, please?
Thank you, Gareth.
God bless you.
Thank you, Gareth.
Thank you, everybody. Come and join us next
Bless
week. Bring your
you.
friends.
Yeah.
God bless all of you. Hope you have a great week.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Blessings.
Bye-bye, Sally. God bless you.
God bless.
Bye-bye.